You're on the Couch Cage side with your host, Kyle Delaney from CouchFire.co. And this installment, I would like to go over and take another closer look and recap the interim welterweight title fight between the natural-born killer, Carlos Condit, and Nick Diaz. Now, there's a lot of aspects that really go into this fight. What I'm going to talk about in this video, obviously I'll recap it. I'm going to talk about the way I scored the fight, the other way it could be seen, how game plan was a big factor in this fight, break down both sides for Condit and Diaz, the coaching. Just going to try and cover every single aspect of this fight because, you know, in the end is that this fight, here's the thing about this fight, is that we were expecting a war, a brawl, you know, between two guys that go out there and look to finish fights. And then what we ended up getting was a typical Greg Jackson fight, a very tactical fight, a fight that had a game plan. In this fight, we weren't really expecting a big game plan, at least from my honest opinion. I was expecting these two to slug it out and somebody was going to get finished. You know, and, you know, that's not discrediting both their chins. Obviously, you know, it could have been a war, it could have gone to decision just because these guys are both tough guys. But what we got is a very technical striking match. That's exactly what we got. It was not a brawl, it was not a war, it was a very technical fight, in my honest opinion. That's how, at least I saw. And then, in regards to this, how I originally scored this fight, I am a Diaz fan, but I really tried to watch this one down the middle, seeing it went to decision. And I scored the fight 48-47 regards to Diaz, but, okay, let me just freeze for a second. I'm not discrediting Carlos Condit at all, is that Carlos Condit fought a very smart fight, and honestly, he could have taken this one 48-47 as well. Where I have a problem with this fight is the people, the judges that scored this fight of 49-46, because I highly disagree with that scoring of this fight. And, you know, I mean, these past two videos now I've had something with judges that it has not been scored the right way. You know, at least make it close, is the fact that, you know, one guy took 3 rounds and one guy took 2 rounds. That's the way I saw it. And, you know, there's a lot of aspects that could also go into this fight, is that, you know, Octagon control is a big aspect of this. And when you have a guy like Diaz who's pressing forward and a guy like Condit who's avoiding the cage and getting back into the center of the Octagon, it's how do you score that Octagon control? You know, I've talked to a lot of people in regards to this, and, you know, I viewed it more as Diaz being, you know, the stalker, almost seeking Carlos Condit, but Carlos Condit would get to the cage, and he'd play it smart, and he'd get back to the center of the ring, because that's, nobody wants to be against the cage against Nick Diaz. So how you score, you know, I thought he was on the offensive, but at the same time is that he wasn't cutting off Condit on the cage. But I saw it as almost like he was putting Condit out of his comfort zone at first, you know, trying to put him up against the cage, and Condit didn't want to be there, and he was, as people like to call it, running away. I don't really see it running away. I see it more as just him trying to avoid the cage. It was a very smart way to fight. But how do you score Octagon control in that? And I really thought Octagon control went to Nick Diaz. But at the same time, is that Nick Diaz wasn't really pinning him up against the cage, but I saw him as almost stalking and forcing Condit to do these things. So how you view it as offensive or defensive, and when Condit would get back in the center, you know, then he'd throw leg kicks and all that, and he did. You know, he outstruck Nick Diaz in a good amount of the rounds. You know, leg kicks was probably the biggest factor in this fight, besides Octagon control, however you viewed it. The leg kicks, in the end, if you're talking about the way the judges scored this fight, is that that's what won the fight for Carlos Condit, is technical leg kicks. He outstruck, he outscored Nick Diaz on the score sheet. So that's how you can view it. But I still scored this one 48-47 Diaz, but I do understand how the judges could have seen Carlos Condit come out victorious in this fight. So that's just how I saw it in regards to that. So, and the person who scored 49-46, you know, not even close in my honest opinion. It has nothing to do with the strikes. You know, if we're talking about the rounds that I thought Diaz took, I thought 1 and 2 were Diaz's, and I thought 5 was Diaz. But, you know, 1 and 2, you know, 2 was very clear-cut for Diaz. 1 could go either way, and I thought 5 was clearly Diaz's. So, you know, that's how I viewed it, but it could also go the other way for Carlos Condit. Now, in regards to this, is that there's other factors that could go into this, is that game plan was a huge factor in this fight. Okay, and really, here's how it goes, is that Carlos Condit stuck to the game plan. He executed it to a T. Okay, his game plan was to avoid the cage, stay in the center of the Octagon, pick him apart with their leg kicks. It's almost like he wanted this one to go to decision. You know, Condit did throw heavy strikes, but it's almost like he knew that he could not finish Nick Diaz, and that's not discrediting Carlos Condit. He's a powerful guy, but Nick Diaz also has a great chin. It's almost like if this one went to the judges, he wanted to make sure that he outstruck Nick Diaz. He had more points than Nick Diaz, and leg kicks were the biggest factor in this one. And the game plan was very simple. It was to stay moving. And, you know, I said this in the beginning of the fight, is that I really like the way Condit is moving. You know, this is the way you work against Nick Diaz. You move and you keep the fight in the center of the ring, because if Nick Diaz corners you into the cage, you're not going to be coming out of there. It doesn't matter how good your chin is. And it's almost like I view this as Carlos Condit having a great deal of respect for Nick Diaz's boxing and for his skills. And also, Condit wanted nothing to do with Nick Diaz's ground game. So it was a very, very smart game plan. You know, Greg Jackson continues to be a tactician. I understand the game of MMA, you know, game planning is very big, and it's a part of the evolution process. So I do understand that. But at the same time, you know, is that we were expecting a war and a brawl, and we ended up getting a tactical fight. So, you know, I want to just say that Nick Diaz, Carlos Condit isn't what turned out to be what we all expected. You know, and it really came down to not brawling, but it came down to smarts and brains and executing a game plan. That's what Carlos Condit did. Now, in regards to the game plan, you can also go to Nick Diaz's side. You know, I thought he took 1 and 2, and then at 5, he finally showed some sort of plan, is that you have to get the fight to the ground. Is that these first 3 rounds, I mean, the first 2 rounds that Diaz was doing a good job striking. Then the 3rd round, Condit starts picking apart with these leg kicks, starts becoming very tactical, and your striking wasn't working for the 3rd round, and the 4th round you were struggling. But where's the game plan is that, you know, if it's not working, if you're having trouble keeping this guy against the cage and he's not giving you a chance to strike, you know, why don't you take the fight to the ground? The way I see it is, you know, I thought this fight would end by submission with Nick Diaz, is that Nick Diaz is the superior Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy. If he got this to the ground, like we saw in the 5th round, if he had more time to operate, we could have very well saw a submission victory for Nick Diaz. He just didn't have enough time, and it wasn't executed at the right time. So in the end, I'm going to say is that Greg Jackson outcoached Cesar Gracie. That's what happened, in my honest opinion. That's how I saw, is that if it's not working, you know, in the 3rd round, mid-4th, it's like, take the guy down and let's try and work the ground game. There's more aspects to MMA than just your hands, and that's not taken away from Nick Diaz's boxing. Nick Diaz has some of the best boxing, but Carlos's game plan was almost like getting rid of Nick Diaz's boxing. So go back to your foundation, which is your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and try and work it. And he did, but there was only 2 minutes left in the 5th round. It was almost too little too late. If he had more time and could have gotten it to the ground, because Condit wanted nothing to do with the ground game. You could see this every time Diaz got him in the clinch. It was get away, and get your space. So there should have been more takedown attempts. There should have been more ground game in this fight from a game plan side for Nick Diaz. So there was also, the way I see it is there was no sense of urgency for Nick Diaz. There wasn't. You know, when we get to, he's too busy taunting, and I noticed this is his style, and he was trying to egg Condit on, like stand and bang with me, but Condit wanted nothing to do with it. And it's very tempting when a guy's standing in your face and calling you out, but there was no sense of urgency after this, is that Condit wasn't buying into it and kept moving away. Where's the urgency? Diaz wasn't letting his hands go in the later rounds, and then finally he gets down to the ground in the 5th, but where's the urgency? It should have been earlier, in my honest opinion. I just see this as Gracie got outcoached, plain and simple. Gracie got outcoached. Where's the core saying, take it to the ground? You know, sometimes, you know, I know Diaz has great boxing. It's almost like he relied too much on his boxing and almost forgot about what his first art was in this sport, and that was his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And that is his bread and butter in the beginning. He used to be a submission fighter, and then he became a very good boxer. So I honestly thought that this fight would get to the ground, and I thought it would end by submission just because of the huge gap in this. So what I see is that, you know, instead of taunting Diaz, you know, it's almost like he was put out of his comfort zone, is that Diaz is used to getting in brawls with people and getting his way because he pushes the pace, he has the great cardio, but Condit wasn't allowing him to get into his game. It's almost like Condit was getting rid of Diaz's boxing, and he put him out of his comfort zone because Diaz is used to brawling. But he couldn't in this fight. It was very tough to brawl. It was very tough to get in a boxing match because Condit's movement was very smart, in my honest opinion. So lastly is that we learn a very, very good lesson. And this one we're learning continuously. It happened with the Chael Sonnen and Bisping fight. It's happened with plenty of fights, is that don't leave it in the hands of the judges. Flat out. You know, you never know what to expect. You know, I thought, and when it came to the decision, I thought Diaz would eke it out. But then Condit, you know, when Condit won, I was like, you know, no big deal. But I heard the 49-46. I'm like, well, that doesn't really add up. You know, it doesn't matter if you outstruck him. It was a lot closer than we all thought to say it was a 49-46. That's my honest opinion. 49-46 does not add up at all. So in the end, is that you cannot leave it in the hands of the judges. And now Carlos Condit gets the title shot. You know, he was a very, very classy opponent. And, you know, if you want to talk about Nick Diaz's antics, it's Nick Diaz being Nick Diaz. You know, he wanted to fight. You know, we were expecting a war and a brawl, and I bet he was expecting the same thing. And Condit, he liked to call it, was running away and backpedaling on his heels most of the fight. So I guess you could see how Diaz calls it. And he did give respect to Carlos Condit, but in the end is that, you know, I'm gonna take it as Nick Diaz being Nick Diaz. In regards to him retiring, I don't think that's the case. You know, Nick Diaz is very unpredictable, but I don't see Nick Diaz retiring. He's going to come back. In my honest opinion, he will be back. You know, plenty of fighters have retired and they've come back, so we've seen this plenty of times in the past. It's just heat of the moment. So we will see what happens. But that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to take a deeper look at this fight, go over, just recap it, and that's what I thought. You know, I wish Carlos Condit the best against Georges St-Pierre, but the way I see this one panning out, you know, in the big gap in ground game, Carlos Condit may be a formidable Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy, but GSP's wrestling and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu will be the X factor in this fight. He will get Condit to the ground, and he will win by submission. I'm calling this one early. So that's what I have for this edition of the Cage Side Couch. This is Kyle Delaney signing off. I'm out of here.